Hello and welcome to another Back to Jerusalem podcast. I'm Eugene Bach, your host for this time, and I'm coming to you live on delay from somewhere within the borders of Sweden. I'm really excited because this week we are releasing a brand new book. So I've asked our office director from the UK to join us, who is running our publishing company. And I think you actually have a copy of the book with you there in the UK, right, Bethany?
I do. Well, it's kind of a sneak peek. It has the kind of publishing proof on the front. So it will look like this without this on it. But yes, we have, and it's a little washed out in the video right here. But yes, we have finally got the proof, and we are live as of today.
The reason I'm excited about this book is because for those of you that have not been following Back to Jerusalem and some of the most recent books that we've put out just within the last 12 months, is that God has kind of brought us on this journey where we have been diving into these old books, finding these treasures that have been written from 100, 200 years ago by these pioneers of faith. And this is one of the books that when I saw it, I think, Bethany, you can share your own experience, but when I first saw this book, I fell in love with it, and here's why. When you look at the Back to Jerusalem journey, we've been doing several video series. We did one that was called Chasing Revival. If you haven't seen Chasing Revival, it's a 9-part video series that we've done with a 61-day devotional. You can go through those together. And basically what it does is it follows the gospel from Jerusalem as it spread all around the world, as it's gone from Jerusalem all the way back to Jerusalem. And so as we do Chasing Revival, we start off in Jerusalem, we move to Asia Minor, Europe, Africa, around to the Americas, and we continue on to the area where the gospel has not yet gone between China and Jerusalem. And we follow the story, we follow the history, we follow that chain link of the gospel, if you will, going from generation to generation, from nation to nation, from continent to continent. And when I saw this book, I was like, this is exactly what we are doing, because the author starts off with the story of Paul, but he doesn't tell the story in like this generic BBC documentary special. Instead, he gives a very, I think, personalized, almost like a narrative of the story of Paul, which is so beautifully written, and then goes from Paul to all these different missionaries around the world, many of them being the very first missionaries in their areas, and shows that link from the very first kind of gospel missionary, if you will, to missionaries throughout time up until the early 1900s, where the book stops because that's when the book was written. What appealed to you, Bethany, when you first saw this book?
Well, for those people that are kind of curious how we do things at Underground Publishing is, you and I work quite differently. We kind of have the same goals and things, but we work quite differently. And so for me, I like to have a schedule. It's kind of how I survive in life. Is I plan my day. I could give you on my phone right now my schedule from the moment I woke up this morning to the moment I'll go to bed. It's planned.
True. We had a meeting in the UK last week, and Bethany was so worried about where are we going to stay. And I was like, oh, I'll get the hotel when I get there. I mean, it's the UK. It's not like I'm traveling to North Korea where I have to make advance notices because, there's no communication link between outside world and in North Korea. I can literally book my hotel in the UK while sitting on the plane on the tarmac coming into the Manchester airport. But you're like, nope.
Not just that, but there are several meetings that were lined up, and one of them you had done all of the communication and organizing, and my anxiety was so high because I'm thinking he's going to have got the wrong day, he's going to have booked the wrong year, he's going to be with the wrong person. And it's not that you're incompetent. That makes it sound like I think that you're, it's not that. It's just I'm very, 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 very planned. So anyway, I say that to say that at Underground, I have our next year planned out because I have to know in my head that once we choose the book, all of the things that go in to getting a book from reading it, discovering it, to physically being in our hand is quite a process. And in order for that to be done effectively, I kind of had to plan things out. And so this year was already planned. We already knew the books that we were going to do this year, from January to December, it was planned out. And so the book that we had for the summer was the China Mission Handbook that we came out with a week ago, was it, I believe? And then while we were preparing this book, you wrote me and you said, I'd found another book, because we're always reading, trying to find other things. This one's kind of cool. And so there's ones that I might find or you might find, and then the other person will look and it's like, yeah, it's okay, but it doesn't grab me. And unless it grabs both of us, we don't do it, because it's kind of a very tiny kind of test pool of people, you and I. And so you sent this one and I started to read it, and I could not believe it was from more than 100 years ago. It read as though it was written yesterday. And it was so unique in that rather than it being kind of a biography feel, which can sometimes be almost academic, can be a little bit taxing, very information heavy, which is great for some people. It's not always great for everyone. This one read like a storybook. It was like an Adventure Time storybook that was just full of these amazing, crazy, real life, well, they're stories, but in reality, they're testimonies. They really are what people have lived out. And it's not just individual testimonies, it's what these missionaries accomplished through their own sacrifice and dedication that ultimately changed entire nations.
And what I also like about this book, which is so special for us, because as you know, and many of that are in our audience has been listening to us for a while would know, we really do try to focus on those missionaries that have never been heard of, those missionaries that are lesser known, those missionaries that made an impact, but their name didn't make it into, the historical documents that we share and share and share over and over and over. I mean, if you are looking for a Hudson Taylor, you can go to Amazon.com and find a plethora of books written about the life of Hudson Taylor, including ones that were written directly by him and his family members, individuals that he worked with on a daily basis, he lived with, they knew him, he knew them intimately, and they really knew his story. But we even have people later on that also have been writing his story, and you'll find different missionaries like Hudson Taylor that will have a lot of different things written about his life, his mission organization, his strategy, his prayer life, his Bible scriptures, his teaching, his preaching, his sermons. So you have those writings that are just everywhere about certain people. But this book covers individuals in nations and lands and tribes that you've never heard of. There was this one that you can retell the story at least a little bit if you like, Bethany. There was this one about the very first missionary, I think it was to the Hawaiian Islands.
No, the Hawaii, was it Fiji?
Fiji, sorry. Yeah, it wasn't Hawaii. That's right. It was Fiji. It was a woman missionary or a female missionary.
Oh, are we sorry? So for everyone listening, while we're trying to work out what page we're both on, there's 27 chapters, which is about 27 stories in this book. So sometimes it's trying to just sort through which one's which. The one that was in Hawaii was one that I loved, and it was about it wasn't a foreign missionary, but foreign missionaries had been, but it was the chief. They call her the chiefess, so like the female chief of the island, called Kapiolani, and she was just. I almost said something I shouldn't say on the podcast. Yeah, she really was a boss. And like she got into a live active volcano, climbed into an active volcano to prove that the fire god that the islanders believed in was, not real, and that her god was. And she just didn't take any mess in. Like she had like witch doctors and the priests of the fire god like threatening to throw her in, and they were like, you need to bring a sacrifice to her, and there's certain berries around the volcano area which they believed kind of were blessed by her and were almost holy. They didn't call it that, but that's essentially what it was. And so she just like ripped off branches and started throwing them into the volcano to prove a point. Like she was just amazing. And the reality was that all of the people in that area saw the reality of her God and were saved. So there are missionaries that travel to countries, amazing individuals that especially were in the South Pacific islands, who almost all of them were killed, if not all of them, that you read about, ministering to cannibal tribes and all kinds of things, and to see the good that came out of it. And also not just that, but the effect that they had on the slave trade. So many of these islanders associated white men with where they would offer the people training or work, and essentially they would kidnap the men and make them into slaves, and the families would never see them again. So there'd be whole islands with no men because they'd been stolen, and the missionaries would be so furious about this, and they did so much work on that front as well. So there are kind of native people like Kapiolani, and then there's also foreign missionaries.
What I liked about the story of Kapiolani is that, which is so true. I mean, you were in the Philippines with the Back to Jerusalem training school. There was on a remote island with indigenous people. And one of the things that we saw that I saw there in the Philippines, and I saw in this book as well, is that a fear controlled religion can really hold people back from education and development and advancement. And so in the Philippines, for instance, there's a remote island that we work on where the people believe, there's a tribe that believes, there's an indigenous religion that they hold dear, that they believe that when somebody dies, their spirit stays in the area where they died. Therefore, the people never get to really do any agriculture, farming, education, school, building up their homes. They're always victims to every hurricane and big storm and flood that comes. Why? Because they don't have any permanent structures. Why? Because every time somebody dies, they believe that spirit stays there, and they are obligated to pick up their entire tribe and move to another location. So if you got a couple people dying in 1 month, that's a busy month because you're constantly moving, and it's every place that you move to is only temporary. So you're almost nomadic without actually being nomadic, which means that you never get to build a solid foundation. You never get to have a home. You never get to plant a garden or a field to feed your people. So you're just kind of going around. And when the people get saved, they're no longer afraid of those spirits. When people come to Christ in those minority groups, they're no longer afraid of that spirit haunting that ground. So they feel free to stay there in the place where the person died, build for their families, do agriculture, planting fields, feeding their children, getting an education for their children. And we see the same thing in that story with this woman in Hawaii, where the people were just handicapped. They were handcuffed to the fear of the fire god of the volcano. And so it wasn't just that she said, my God is better than your God and your God can't hurt me kind of thing. It was that she was doing things that were sacrilegious, that if you do these things, the fire god will kill you. And she would deliberately do things that you're not supposed to do, and then ask the people, look around. I'm still here. I'm still standing. Your God isn't real. The fear that you have isn't real. My God breaks the chains, the bondages of that fear. And it really kind of was embodied in her because, like you said, she was a boss. She was fearless. She was this fearless believer that went before the people preaching the good news and did things that violated their God. And while reading this book, it's not just missionaries. I love the title of it being Missionary Heroes, because heroes are individuals who seem fearless and they go against the grain. They stand alone by themselves. We see the Elijahs, we see the Davids, we see the disciples. We see the Bible stories that are reliving of these heroes that stood against all odds because they knew they were on the side of righteousness. And I'm reminded, even with while we're doing this podcast right now, we're in the week actually of the Paris Olympics. And the Paris Olympics were so gross, but very few Christians are brave enough to kind of, talk about how gross those opening ceremonies actually were. I mean, there are a few, but there are quite a number that are like, you know what, just remain quiet. It's, you don't have to watch it. Just be loving to everybody, be accepting. And I think that was actually what the Paris Olympics were actually saying, is that, okay, these were done, to be more accepting of other religions. But these are heroes that stood in the face of their own culture. They stood in the face of what was considered to be kosher, not kosher, rude, not rude, damning, not damning. And they preached the gospel without fear and without shame.
Could you imagine if Capilani had read the Cultural Intelligence Mission book that I read a few months ago? And it's all about respecting people's culture, which I do want to re-emphasize again. There are some good things in that book. It wasn't all bad, but just a lot of it was. And I think when you look at these missionaries, so many of them, I mean, you were talking about unknown missionaries too. So the only you and I are pretty well read on missionaries. There are people much more well read than us, but we're probably more well read on missionaries than the average person. And it was only one person in this book that we knew, which was David Livingstone. And he is, of course, a very well-known missionary. But I can almost guarantee that he will be the only one that you'll recognize in this book. All the others were completely unknown. But so many of these, it could be read through this lens of these were white men that went and interfered in native culture that had nothing to do with them. Yeah, you can look at it that way, but how to rob these people of the truth and the beauty of the gospel that was brought to them. It wasn't about who brought it. It doesn't matter. And also something I want to get to later, which I'm sure we will, is the last section of the book is about Middle Eastern believers from 200 years ago, which is pretty amazing because you don't get so much of that stuff. But these certain tribes that were cannibals. I don't know if you can call that culture. I mean, it kind of is, but I don't know if we want to be culturally respectful of cannibalism. But there was a lady, I think her name was Mary, I'm pretty certain her name was Mary Slessor or something. And she stopped several tribal wars. Where she would talk to the chiefs of the two tribes, and she'd be like, stop your fighting, like they were two toddlers. And in reality, they were about to kill each other. And so these missionaries did not go and bring British culture where they went. They went and they brought the kingdom of heaven. They brought the reality of what it is to follow Christ, and entire nations, cultures, people were saved as a result.
I was in a church service yesterday, and there are times where if you listen to a sermon in a different language, you actually understand it maybe a little bit different than you did from your mother language. And yesterday we were talking about James, but James led me, and I often do this where I'm sitting in a church service and I hear the pastor say something that I'm motivated by, and then my brain starts to wander and I start to kind of look at other things connected to the idea. So the idea yesterday was draw near to God and God draws near to you. And the message came from the book of James. And as I was thinking about that, I was reminded of this book. This is the Bible verse that I read yesterday, and I just want to read it to our audience because this directly relates to the book, and this might be a way of looking at it in a way that maybe you never have. I know I certainly had never looked at it this way before until I heard this verse in a different language, and it reminded me of our book. 1 John chapter 4. This is the great chapter, right, that we always look at because God is love. And that's the part that says that God is love is the part that I focus on so much. But then if I go just a little bit further from John chapter 4, 7 and 8 and look at verse 13 to 16, it says this in verse 13, this is how we know we live in him and he in us. He has given us his Spirit. And we have seen and testified that the Father has sent his Son to be the Savior of the world. If anyone acknowledges that Jesus is the Son of God, God lives in them and they in God. I had never really thought of it that way before. I've always thought about being a Christian, right? Where God lives in me. And everywhere I go, God is with me because he is in me. And even if he's not in me, he's still everywhere anyway because he's omnipresent, right? But I never really grasped or thought about the idea, the concept that I'm also in God, that he loves me. And therefore, he takes a part of me with him everywhere he goes because he's omnipresent. He's taking me wherever he is. Now try to follow me just a little bit on this because I don't want to get like new agey, but I'm reminded of a story. So last month we came out with a book. It's the true story of an amazing hero of the faith named Shagufta Khalsa. And she was thrown in prison, put on death row in Pakistan for refusing to deny her faith. She was put on death row for 8 years. And according to her understanding, because she wasn't just on death row for 8 years, she was in solitary confinement the entire time. And so she's sitting in solitary confinement, and according to everything that she understands about the world, she's a poor peasant, she's a cleaner, she's a janitor, and nobody knows her, nobody cares about her. She's by herself, and she's in solitary confinement. She's been praying for God to release her, but it's been almost 8 years, and she doesn't even know if he hears her cry. Little did she know that not only did God hear her cry, but God was taking her story to his people in other parts of the world, and they were praying for her. And one night, her prison just collapses. It just falls. And it falls all around her. She's not harmed. And even a hair on her head was not budged. But she stood in the middle of this rubble that used to be her prison, which basically disintegrated around her. It could have walked out if she wanted. But she didn't. She stayed there. And it just reminded her that God is with me. This prison cell will fall. Not knowing that God took her burden and shared it with his people in other areas. This reminds me of these stories. Why? Because I believe that God is not just omnipresent, meaning that he's everywhere at once. I believe he's also omnipresent, meaning that he's every time at once. He doesn't just exist in the here and now, but he exists in the past. He exists in the future. And if he loves you and I, like this verse says in the Bible, where he carries us in him, that means our stories, our testimonies, our writings, the messages that God gives us will be echoed into eternity, because the same God that gave us the message of today, he will give to other people in the future and other people in other parts of the world. And that's kind of what I feel from this book, that it's almost like God breathes testimonies on the lives of individuals. And because they loved him, he lived inside of them. And because he loved them and they loved him, they also lived inside of him. Does that make sense? I mean, this is a strong verse that I've never seen it like that before. And after I've explained it, people will be like, well, I don't know how I feel about this idea that we live in God. But if you look at the analogy of the vine being grafted into the vine, it starts to make sense in the way that our testimonies go further than our own influence. They go further than our own lifetime. They echo in eternity, because the eternal God that blessed us will live forever. Therefore, the testimony that he gave to us will also live forever. John chapter 4, verse 13. This is how we know that we live in him and he in us. He has given us his Spirit, and we have seen and testify that the Father has sent his Son to be the Savior of the world. And if anyone acknowledges that Jesus is the Son of God, God lives in them and they in God. That is the New King James Version. That is where I feel these stories take on a new meaning for me, because God carried these testimonies just as they carried the testimony of what God did in their lives and wrote it down. God too carries their testimonies because he loved them. He loves them still. Therefore, the testimonies of his children he carries with him and gives as an encouragement to his other children. And that's what this book is for me. It is a continuation of encouragement and testimony of God in us and us in God.
I think testimonies are something that we really want to re-emphasize value on at Underground, because I think so much of the Christian book landscape today is kind of self-help books in some kind of way. They're kind of a how to live a blessed life or a godly life or even a holy life. It's not that they're bad things, but the power of testimonies, of stories, is not as maybe as, I don't believe it's not as popular, but maybe it's not as valued in the Christian space as it should be. And so to have this kind of treasure trove of stories collected together, I think is so powerful. And so many of these missionaries, I'm thinking of a missionary called Childers, and he was a young boy from Scotland who ended up going to Africa. And he remembers vividly hearing David Livingstone share and saying, one day I'm not going to be here. And this is my story. This is what I've experienced in Africa. This is what God called me to. And the laborers are needed. Are you going to do it? Yes or no? And he remembers being a child and hearing that. And it stayed with him forever. And so the missionary stories here that we believe will encourage, challenge, reinvigorate the readers were also challenged and reinvigorated by stories that came before them. And it's like Chasing Legacy, the new series that we're working on, this idea of honoring the people that have gone before us by learning of their legacy, by learning of what they've done. And I think that that's why I love that it has a whole section on the Middle East, stories from the 1800s that were happening in the Middle East. It's so rare. You hear an awful lot about Africa. There's a lot more about China these days in terms of history from back then. But stories of missionaries in the Middle East or native believers, there's a particular story about two friends that is so powerful at the end of this book. How I don't know if you want me to tell you because it might take some time, but there's two friends, Abdallah and Sabat, and they're actually traveling to Mecca, and it's in the year 1805. And they decide they're going to travel to Mecca together. They do their prayers. And then they continue on, and they actually end up in Kabul, Afghanistan, which to me already is just so exciting to read about what was happening in Afghanistan in the 1800s with believers there. And Abdallah makes friends with someone in position there, and he ends up staying, and Sabat continues on. Abdallah is given a New Testament in Arabic, and he reads it, and he's immediately converted. He receives Christ. And he begins to travel home, and the message somehow has already reached back home before he even arrives there that he's converted to Christianity. And he actually meets Sabat on the road as he's walking home to his village. And he sees his friend, and he starts to tell him about what Christ has done for him. And Sabat is furious with anger, just with rage. And he drags him before the king and the Muslim leaders and says he should be put to death. And it's a really difficult story to read in some ways, because Abdallah is forced to stand there, and they cut off each of his arms, tell him to renounce Christ, and he won't. They cut off his feet, he won't, and he just has a horrendous experience. And eventually he's beheaded. And Sabat walks away feeling justified because he says, this is what Allah commands. And he walks away and is tormented by what's just happened, because what is it that means that his friend would go through what just happened and not renounce a God that he's only known for, a couple weeks? And eventually, I don't want to tell the whole story because it's amazing and I want people to read it, but eventually Sabat is also given a New Testament, and he receives Christ after comparing it to the Quran and finding the truth in the Bible. He goes to Malaysia, he loses his faith, he regains it, and ultimately he is killed for his faith. But to read of these two amazing believers from the 1800s that were in the Middle East and traveled to Afghanistan through Syria and Iran, and hearing the stories of how God was not just working in Africa, like we all think and how we all know, but he was also working in an area that was so dominated so recently by Islam, and experiencing persecution that many of our brothers and sisters experience today. But it's such a powerful collection of stories from all over the world, from believers that suffered and carried the gospel and ultimately had a huge impact on the world.
And told by a very gifted author. It's one thing to have a powerful story, but it's another thing to be able to tell that story in a way that's enjoyable. Some people will just push through a powerful story because it's a good story, even though the description, the writing is horrendous. And you kind of have to suffer through like the butchering of a good story in order to get the meat or the essence. That's not the case. This book is so well written. Just from a literary standpoint, you get you have an amazing storyteller that makes you feel warm. I mean, if you are looking for chicken soup for the soul, to sit beside a fire with a cup of tea or coffee early morning, cold, and just be encouraged, this is the book, because this uses language. This uses words that I feel are just a way to communicate, like a warm fuzziness that you lose yourself in the story itself. So if you are someone who likes to read novels, if you're someone that likes to read about adventure, if you're someone that really appreciates good writing, like classic writing from like the 1800s, early 1900s, you'll find that with this book. Rare English words will appear again on your page, and the ability to tell a story in such a seamless way that you lose yourself in the testimony, thinking that you're there. You forget that you're reading sometimes while you're reading the story. So that's it.
But also, it's not kind of a thee thou kind of writing. It's, you know, this could have been written yesterday. There's no kind of words that make you feel like it was written hundreds of years ago, but it has a very modern feel, but with that real literary art that's woven into it. It's an amazing story, or collection of stories. So just also to reiterate for people, you can find it on Underground Publishing. You can find it on backtojerusalem.com. That's for the ebook, or if you would like the physical paperback copy, which we have discovered many people still enjoy, which is a great thing for us. You can get it on anywhere on Amazon, the Book of Missionary Heroes.
The Book of Missionary Heroes, available on Underground Publishing or backtojerusalem.com. Or if you want the printed version, you can go to amazon.com. Thank you so much, Bethany, for bringing the book, sharing it with our audience. It's always great to discuss these amazing treasures together with you.
Thanks.
And I want to thank you so much for downloading this Back to Jerusalem podcast. Again, I'm Eugene Bach, your host for this time, coming to you live on delay from somewhere within the borders of Sweden. God bless.